Okay, so it sounds like my voice is okay on that. I just took a look again. All right, so let's go to how this. I'm going to probably do these streams from upstairs in the office. For whatever reason, this computer is a little bit slower than what's upstairs in the classroom, and rather than my staying down here in my office, I'll head up there and we can utilize that space and try to get maybe the whiteboard behind me so I can continue to use the board just as if we were lecturing, though I'll have to prop the camera in a different direction. So just real quick, this, I don't know how much longer we're going to be in the situation where it's not on campus. It may return to quote unquote normal in 2 weeks. After the numbers in Calhoun maybe come down, settle down a little bit. Seems like it spiked up into the 6% permeation of the virus. And so we're going to try to get that down at countywide down below 4%. And I think that gets us back in the classroom, but I don't know. So this may be what we do from here on out. I can set up, Zoom meetings and or Teams, but that's not what we intended to do. This was supposed to be a face-to-face class. I can't make it mandatory for you even to tune into our lectures because it's not face-to-face. But as I also told you, everything that we have for the class is already online. Your assignments do not change. Taking the tests do not change. What changes is my delivery and our ability to interact with one another. So we'll keep doing this for as long as we have to and hopefully get you guys back in the classroom as soon as possible. We left off, we were talking about the presidency. We went through those 6 roles of the president. Of course, primary to that primary role of the president is that of chief executive. The responsibility to execute the solutions to the problems that you and I, through our representatives, have identified and we want government to work on. And the chief executive, is the top of that organization, of all that bureaucracy all the way down to that street level bureaucrat. And they're the ones who are then responsible for making sure that those solutions to the problems identified are carried out. That's their primary role. Secondary roles, some just as important, like commander-in-chief, for example, keeping the country protected and safe based on that role of the president being the general's general. So he's on top of the military apparatus, but it's still structured the same way, top down through different divisions, all the way down to the individuals who fight and win the wars with a lot of middle management, so to speak, in between. The chief of state, which is both a ceremonial and popular leader, in my opinion. Some textbooks separate the popular leader from the chief of state, but I think it's all rolled into one. We didn't talk about this, but the idea that the closest thing we have to royalty in this country really is our first family, even though, again, titles nobility are forbidden in the U.S. Constitution. But our president of the United States, the first family of the United States, is the closest thing we really have to royalty. And early on, they were Washington and the like, those who came shortly after, were really treated as royalty, even though we know they weren't. But that was the system we knew. But having said that, again, that gives us an individual in the White House that we're all connected to, much to some individuals' chagrin. And to others, they couldn't be more pleased. And that happens every 4 years with the quality and the caliber of the individuals who are elected. Again, presidents serve, as the Constitution indicates, through amendment. Presidents can serve up to really 2 terms plus if they happen to come in less than 2 years into their predecessors' term. So if a vice president takes over for a president for whatever reason, resignation and the resignation and in terms of what happened to Nixon, and then four assassinations in our history that cut terms short, and then a couple of presidents died while in office. So once that line of succession takes place, the vice president becomes the president, and if it's within the last 2 years of the president's original term, then they can serve out that term and then serve 2 more full terms. So close to 10 years is the standard, or the maximum, I should say, for whatever a president can serve. 2 terms is is generally the max. And again, that's more of a relatively recent. I mean, well, it comes after Roosevelt. FDR was elected 4 times into the presidency, and shortly within that 4th time, he died while in office. And so there is when the amendment to the Constitution was added to term limit presidents after 2 terms. Washington mandatorily, or not mandatorily, voluntarily stepped out of his role as president. Really interesting. You know, he probably could have been elected and elected and elected. Like I said, we really treated Washington early on like as if he were a king, and so that position would have been his and probably would have continued to be his. But you know, who knows, right? People are fickle. The support for federalism waned and changed to the support for anti-federalism, and so who knows how much longer Washington would have lasted. But I think Washington's setting that tradition of just serving 2 terms and getting out was became the benchmark. And you know, who knows if other presidents would have voluntarily followed that. A number of, like I said, violent presidents were assassinated while in office. Obviously Lincoln, for example, but then you had those who died in office, and then those who were just simply defeated and served as 1-term presidents. So a couple of 2-termers early on. Jefferson was a 2-term president. Madison was a 2-term president. President Adams was, like I said, the original 1-term president. But regardless, the terms for president are set now by the Constitution. When we get to Franklin Roosevelt, we get into both the Depression and then World War II. And the argument was made that you wanted a steady hand at the helm, so to speak, to get through those most tumultuous times. But running for 4 terms certainly allowed Roosevelt to not only shape really the federal government into what it is today, the modern presidency and the modern federal government today, one that's very, very active and one that seems to step through the states versus working with the states. And then on top of that, he really left his mark on the Supreme Court, which of course helped Congress, the reformers, the progressives in Congress to really reshape their role and transform the states more so into, I think, regions than our typical true definition of state, which is that bounded area, that sovereign. So Roosevelt's impact upon the courts and how many justices he ultimately had the opportunity to appoint and that were you know, made justices by the advice and consent of the Senate really helped to shape that judicial activist streak, an active court, and one that was ready to embrace, after a while anyway, the New Deal policies of FDR. So throughout our time, we've had 3 presidents now, most recently President Trump, but 3 presidents have been impeached. No president has been removed from office. We have 1 president who would have been impeached and most likely would have been removed. I mentioned him earlier, in Nixon in the early 1970s. But no president has been forcibly removed from office for high crimes and misdemeanors, which is the standard of impeachment and removal. As stated, most recently, President Trump had been impeached, not unlike President Clinton at the time, and really even President Lincoln. After his assassination, his vice president that took over, Andrew Johnson, he was impeached as well. And each time you had a very, very partisan, and I guess would make sense, but a very partisan House that does the impeaching. The impeachment process is really like an indictment, like we would have in the courts, where somebody is indicted before they stand trial for a crime. The grand jury is convened. They look at the evidence. They come to some conclusion whether there's enough evidence that would warrant a trial. And after they make that conclusion, you go forward with a trial. Well, that's same structure is really set up in our bicameral legislature, checks and balances. With the President of the United States, you've got the House of Representatives does the indicting or impeaching, so to speak. They gather evidence and take a look at it. And then basically a majority vote, if they have 50% of the House voting for impeachment, they can move it on. And then it goes to the Senate, and the Senate really acts as a jury in what is, for all intents and purposes, a trial, which is attempting to remove the President of the United States, or finding him not guilty of the charges, or not impeachable. The offense was not impeachable, or whatever the case may be. And as I said, whether it was President Trump most recently, or President Clinton in the 1990s, neither was removed from office through the vote of the Senate. Now, the how, if we go all the way back to Andrew Johnson, kind of an interesting. I mean, we think today's times are tumultuous. Let's never forget, we were in a civil war, a true civil war between the states, between different ideologies, between really different ideologies in terms of what the relationship was between the federal government and the states. Of course, the issue was slavery, without a doubt, but it's not only slavery that led to the Civil War. And throughout that process, again, you had brother against brother, family against family, state against state, right? And so we think about how tumultuous it is right now with Antifa and the Tea Party, and the different BLM, and the different groups of individuals who have basically established a position and are unwavering in their positions. And but take us back 150 years ago, 160 years ago, and we were in the middle of a true civil war where we were literally killing each other. So it was extremely, obviously, tumultuous. As we know, Lincoln was assassinated shortly after his second term of office, and that's when Andrew Johnson took over. Now, Andrew Johnson was a senator from Tennessee. Tennessee was on the fence regarding the issue of slavery. You had it kind of divided as a state, and Johnson was chosen from Tennessee, which ultimately remained loyal to the Union, but at the same time, Johnson was a Democrat, and so it was a way of unifying the country, so to speak. Obviously, we know that Lincoln was the first elected Republican president, not the first to run for office, but the first elected to that office. Fremont was the first Republican candidate, and Lincoln chooses Johnson to be his running mate, and again, a way of trying to pull the parties together, to soften what would come after the Civil War, and in terms of pulling the nation back together, provided the North was successful in doing that. And so after Lincoln's assassination, many individuals pointed the finger at Johnson as being a Southern sympathizer, being too soft, maybe even having something to do with Lincoln's assassination. And so the ranks of individuals, the Republicans, both in Congress and in the Senate and the House, but also the departments, the different departments that were, again, that create the cabinet for the president, they were very much interested in getting Johnson out of there. I mean, Johnson truly was softly folding the Southern states back into the Union, which was really Nixon's lead. Nixon started that process, recognizing that if you're going to pull the nation back together after the war, there has to be it has to be conciliatory in the context that, think of it this way: if you have 5 players on a basketball court, and they're your 5 players, they're playing as a team, and 2 in the middle of a game say, "We don't want to play anymore, right? We're done." How do you get them to play basketball? I mean, the other 3 players can go and physically pull them onto the court, but how do you actually get them to play ball? How do you get them to play basketball, to be a part of the team, to be active, to be supportive, all those things that are necessary in a successful team? How do you do that? You can't do it by force per se. And Lincoln knew that. You couldn't pull the South back into this union, this more perfect union, without addressing some of the issues that the South had been pointed to as why they needed to break away, to end this contract, so to speak. Um, and at the same time, again, you had to give them a reason to be a part of this team, and you couldn't do that by force. And so Lincoln recognized that, and he, where he could, was pulling the South back into the Union. Um, Recognizing the Southern soldiers not as rebels to the degree, but fighters, soldiers, and taking those kinds of steps. And Johnson just carried that on. He carried on Lincoln's lead, and not every individual appreciated that, particularly the Secretary of War, Stanton. Stanton wanted Johnson gone. In fact, Stanton, I think, wanted to be president of the United States. And in the tumult during the period of time of Reconstruction and the assassination of Lincoln, there was a vacuum, and there was a power struggle. And that power struggle was from the Republicans, the radical Republicans, really headed up by Stanton and individuals like Zechariah Chandler in the Senate, and Stevens and other individuals in Congress. They were pushing for I guess for the South to pay for what they had brought to the nation, so to speak, that deadly, terrible Civil War. And they had no interest in softly folding these traitors back into the Union. And so now you get this power struggle between the two. Well, Johnson's the president of the United States. That cabinet underneath him, they serve at the pleasure of the president. They are employees ultimately of the president. And so Johnson goes to fire Stanton, to remove him from his position. And Stanton refuses to go. He refuses to accept the pink slip. And so what he ultimately, what happens is that his allies in the Congress and the legislature, they hurriedly pass legislation that basically says, Johnson, you can't fire these. If the Senate has to confirm them, and you can't simply fire them. And they pass that, and it's vetoed, and the veto is overridden. And then Johnson still ends up believing that it's unconstitutional, doesn't even follow the law. And I'd have to take a look at the courts in terms of that whole process playing out. But the courts maybe even agreed with Johnson that it wasn't constitutional, that you couldn't simply by the Senate changing the rules of the executive branch, change the makeup of the executive branch. Regardless, Stanton's not going, and Johnson is attempting to make him go. That leads to the impeachment. Johnson has now broken the law. And as I said, the standard in the Constitution is high crimes and misdemeanors. And what does that mean? Ultimately, it means whatever the House of Representatives wants it to mean. As we saw the most recent impeachment of President Trump, that weren't, I think history will look back on that and show that as really more a hyper-partisan impeachment, probably a sham impeachment over his conversation with the newly elected president of the Ukraine in at the very least, fairly controversial issue regarding Burisma and interference with our elections, and asking the president of the Ukraine to get to the bottom of that. And it really, there was no standing for an impeachment, but one took place, and right along party lines, Dems control the House of Representatives. The president of the United States was impeached, and then of course it went to the Senate. Senate controlled by the Republicans. No chance of even getting close to the supermajority, the 2/3 vote of the Senate for removal. It just wasn't going to happen. Johnson's on the other hand, right? The Republicans control the House, and the Republicans squarely control the Senate. This is the Civil War, post-Civil War, obviously. And so the House easily impeaches him, and it goes before the Senate. And then again, you got to get to that 2/3 votes, and it's getting very close to his removal. And I believe it was a senator from Pennsylvania, Senator Ross, who said, I can't in good conscience remove the president on this in this process. This is not, I just can't do it. John F. Kennedy did these profiles of courage, and one of his profiles of courage was on Ross, because of that immense pressure from that he must have felt, certainly from his party, maybe even from his nation. And as a representative of the state of Pennsylvania, northern state, he really put himself out there to stand up for the vice president of the United States, and point out that this had been a pushed through law specifically made to put Johnson in a position where either he had to stay with Stanton, who was undermining his every move, or fire him and then risk impeachment, which is what was ultimately happening. And so he staves impeachment by just that one vote. Other votes, obviously, he needed 2/3, but that vote, that last vote, came to Ross, and Ross voted no for removal. And Johnson hangs on, but he's quite injured after that, and he's not a very effective president following that. And at every turn, the Congress is really thwarting his attempt to softly fold the South back into the Union. Kind of an interesting one. And then, of course, we know that the Clinton impeachment was, a lot of people think it was about having, sex with Lewinsky, right? Monica Lewinsky. And it really wasn't about the sex with Monica Lewinsky. It was an investigation that included, it was wide, right? Ken Starr was given this wide investigatory authority to kind of look into all the dealings of the president, because there were a lot of gates that had kind of risen. Like Watergate, everything has a gate. So there's Filegate, and Travelgate, and the Whitewater land deal gate, that were all being looked at. And on top of that, there was this continuous, perpetuated, and I guess I would just say alleged, because it's still alleged. Paula Jones had alleged that President Clinton, prior to his becoming President Clinton, while he was still an official in Arkansas, either the Attorney General or the Governor of Arkansas, that he had sexually harassed Paula Jones, that he had basically elicited sexual favors from her for as she felt, as a condition of her job, which is obviously no bueno, right? And so that was also, I guess, tacitly being investigated at the same time, along with everything else, by Ken Starr. And then when the president came in to be deposed, right before this grand jury, the special counsel that had been brought forth, the president has an obligation to be honest and truthful, and to perjure yourself is a felony, right? A high crime. And so the president was being asked a number of questions, and then, kind of out of left field, Ken Starr team asks about this alleged affair with Monica Lewinsky, right? Where does this come from? And that's where we get, I never had an affair. I don't really even know who this is. Who are you speaking of? All of the obfuscation of the president at the time, that nothing untoward actually happened. And later, as it comes out, we come to find that that's just not true. Well, that's perjury, and as such, that becomes part of the impeachment articles of impeachment that are put before the House, and the House votes to impeach. Then it goes on to the Senate, and again, now the Senate's controlled by the Republicans as well at this time, but they don't have the 67 votes in the House. They're not 67 Republicans, I should say, in the Senate, 67 Republicans in the Senate to actually get to that 2/3. But it came pretty close. I mean, I believe it was 55 to 45, something to that effect. And you would think it was all partisan, but it wasn't. I think it was 5 Republicans that voted not to remove, and 5 Democrats actually voted to remove. So, it was, I guess, closer to a bipartisan removal, certainly, than what we saw with President Trump. Regardless, President Clinton did not get forcibly removed. He was impeached, though, but not removed, just like our current president. And the Constitution sort of lays out that process as to who the players are and what the thresholds are for impeachment and removal, but not necessarily all of the inner workings. The Chief Justice resides as the judge. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides as the judge. The House of Representatives acts as the prosecuting entity, and then the White House has its defense counsel, and that's how that ultimately plays out. But again, what is a high crime or misdemeanor? Whatever the House really wants to deem. I mean, if the House made it up and just made something up that was neither a high crime nor a misdemeanor, they could. The court, I guess, could step in to evaluate whether or not the Constitution, its intent and meaning, would allow for Congress to impeach an individual for jaywalking or for some other misdemeanor offense, not paying parking tickets or something like that, which that's a civil infraction. I mean, I'd be misdemeanor. So the courts, I assume, through judicial review, might step in to determine to what level the House can just make it up as they go along. But for the most part, I mean, the Constitution's clear. The House impeaches, and the Senate ultimately removes. And so that would be an interesting fight to pull the courts into trying to decipher what the framers of the Constitution meant by high crimes and misdemeanors. So the last thing that we wanted to talk about regarding the presidency was really the Electoral College, how we elect the president. And there's, in your Moodle page, there's a primer that takes you through the electoral process and hopefully answers any of the questions you might have. So in terms of structure and how the process works, I would refer to that, and that will save me some time of going over it. It's there for you. But just to have a conversation about the Electoral College and why it was put in place, why it's in the Constitution, why I personally think it's a good thing, and for you to consider as well. We can kind of hit that. That's not necessarily included in that how the Electoral College works piece. That's again linked in your Moodle page. But so I think the Electoral College actually benefits Michigan. There are some individuals who believe that we better go to a popular vote and have created a scheme, for lack of a better term, to get us to the popular vote by having the state legislatures, which are constitutionally, in the U.S. Constitution, constitutionally responsible for determining how the electors of the state are appointed. But having those states, either through resolution or whatever their process is, if the governor should get involved or not, I don't think it's necessary. But regardless, if you involve the governor and actually pass into policy or law that, depending on how your popular vote goes, then your electors will be assigned to the nation's popular vote winner. This has been kind of a push that's been going on a little bit, quite a bit behind the scenes. Again, I'm not a big fan of that. I don't think that creating these kind of compacts, which may and of themselves may be unconstitutional, state-to-state compacts, which is really what this is, and it's this agreement that, however the popular vote comes out, the states will then assign those electors based on the national popular vote, regardless of what their state determines. I just think it's it kind of goes against the intent and the spirit of the Constitution, and may even go against the Constitution as written, what we call de jure versus de facto, or de jure versus de facto. The Electoral College was really put in place first recognizing that most individuals wouldn't know who these presidential candidates were, even though they were given the right to vote. Not every individual had the right to vote, obviously, early on. Taxpayers, property owners, and that gave way to simply just white males, and then that gave way to um, um, males of any color, right, with the uh, 15th Amendment to the Constitution. And then, of course, not just males anymore, but then females as we get into the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And then, of course, we dropped the age down from 21 to 18 with, I believe, the 26th Amendment to the Constitution. So we've changed who can ultimately vote now. It's not all the same individuals or same players. So the interests have changed and spread out. But early on, even though you had a narrow group of individuals voting, the ability for someone who had the right to vote, a citizen who had the right to vote, knowing anything about a candidate that wasn't within their state would be very, very difficult. I mean, the newspaper system wasn't like a national news system. Obviously, there was no radio or TV. There was no Fox News or CNN or any of these other outlets that get us information, almost information overload anytime we want it. We can pull it up on our phones if we want to see what the polling is at any given time, or where a candidate stands on any issue that might be important to us. We have that ability now, but we certainly didn't have that ability in the late 1700s, right? And so when we think about the Constitution's ratification in kind of the originalist view, you had to put us in the time, and the time was we didn't have the ability to necessarily know who those candidates were who were running for office. So we created the system, this college, where it would be the responsibility of these individuals to get to know who the presidential candidates were, and then to cast their vote accordingly based upon the interest of their state. And because we were allowing this electoral college to ultimately choose who the president was, we ran into the same issues, I guess. The framers would have ran into the same issues in the debate and the discussion that they did regarding representation in the House and the Senate. Should the states with more population have more say who the president is, who the chief executive is, the commander-in-chief is? Or should it be equal across the states, every state getting an equal say in who this individual is, since they're going to be representing the United States and doing and executing policies on behalf of the United States? And so the default was to simply line it up the same way they lined up the bicameral legislature, mixing population and the equality, the Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise, mixing those two together. And that's how they came up with the number of electors that each state gets in the choosing of the president. As we know, the House of Representatives, 435 House members, right? The U.S. Senate has 100 U.S. senators. The U.S. Senate is the chamber of equality amongst the states, and so every state has 2 U.S. senators, no matter its population or size or whenever it came into the union, and none of that matters. Each state gets 2 U.S. senators. Now, the House, on the other hand, has 435 members, and that number has been static for quite some time. And so, with every census, when we come and do population distribution in the United States, as some states' population goes up and other states stay stagnant or don't grow, or in the case of Michigan with the last census actually lost population, we lose representatives in the House of Representatives, and other states gain as a portion of that 435. So we're at 14 members of the House of Representatives right now. You did that who represents you assignment, which included figuring out who your congressman was. So one of those 14 individuals who represents you. And we're in District 3 if you're in Calhoun County. And we came to find that our representative, who's not running for re-election, so it'll be somebody different, but currently is Justin Amash, right? So he's one of the 14. And then you also found that there's 2 U.S. senators who represent you, and that was easy for quite a few. You didn't seem to be too difficult finding out who those individuals were. But that your 2 U.S. senators currently are Debbie Stabenow and Gary Peters, and of course Gary Peters is running for re-election right now, so he may or may not be our U.S. senator coming into next year. But those are 2 U.S. senators, and again, we have 14 House members. That gives us 16 federal legislators. I don't know why I'm doing that. That's 7, but gives us 16 federal legislators. And 16 federal legislators equate then to 16 electoral votes that go towards this choosing of the president. Again, the full process, getting to 270, the requirement of 270, the fact that different states like California have a lot more people, and so their number of electoral votes, I think it's 55 still, is 55 versus Michigan 16, and we're one of the big states, by the way. But that should give you an understanding of how large in terms of population California is. I mean, it's just packed with people, right? In the state of Michigan, less packed. Interesting thing, right? So Michigan's population is about 10 million people, right? It's probably more than 10 million. I think our next census will show it's over 10 million, but it's about 10 million people. The city of New York, right? New York City, not the state of New York, but New York City. The city of New York is about 9 million people. That one city, the city of New York, the 5 boroughs, Manhattan, the Bronx, that city of New York has as many people in it as the whole state of Michigan. Almost, right? So all of the UP, all of Detroit, all of Grand Rapids, all of Battle Creek, all of Calhoun equal all those people in the city of New York, right? And so when individuals talk about, who's deciding for whom the policies and the directives and what we want in a chief executive, you can understand that those individuals who don't live in the city, who may live in the UP, have a very different understanding of what good government looks like, and a very different line of wants and or needs from the federal government, right? So 10 million people, state of Michigan, 9 million, 8 or 9 million people in the city of New York, right? Trying to make decision as to what they want from government. They're not the same. And so the Electoral College reflects that. So you take the biggest 15 states, Michigan's included in those, and they can determine the outcome of the presidential election. They get us to 270. They can get us to 270. Some would argue that that's not fair either, that there's a lot of smaller states, flyover country, that has nearly no say in who the president of the United States is. But I don't live there, right? I live in Michigan, and so do you if you're taking this class. And truth be told, that gives us a little bit more say in a presidential election. And if politics comes back to self-interest, that should be of self-interest to you, right? We're a purple state. That makes us valuable. Candidates spend some time here. They recognize our issues as issues. The auto industry, manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, the Great Lakes. If they want our support, they have to tend to our issues. And that's not a disadvantage to us. So if we want to look at it selfishly, right, in terms of self-interest, the Electoral College benefits the state of Michigan. And for that reason, we shouldn't be quick to try to get rid of it. The flip side of that, or what often happens, is we don't like the outcome of the election, and we want to point to something that could be changed or might be changed that would give us a better outcome next time. If the popular vote favors one candidate, but the Electoral College favors another, and your candidate didn't win, then darn that Electoral College. And the flip side is true. If your candidate wins the Electoral College but doesn't win the popular vote, then let's keep that Electoral College. And because the country is fairly evenly split, good luck getting a constitution, because you're going to need a constitutional amendment to change the Electoral College. Good luck getting a constitutional amendment to actually change the Constitution and to change the Electoral College or to write it out. That's where this scheme of this getting the states and state legislatures to agree that they'll go with whoever wins the popular vote. I just don't see it happening. And here's the other thing. When you put this agreement in place today, you have an election. 4 years later, you have another election. Does the agreement still hold? It's a different set of legislators. they may not have that same, they may actually get elected because the people didn't like that proposal or change in the law. So you can take a look at that, the popular vote movement online. You can see that there are a couple of states already that have agreed to that, and if they can get up to the 270 of the electoral votes, then really then the game's over. I mean, as long as they stick to their agreement, and whoever wins the popular vote, they all cast their electoral votes for that candidate, regardless of what their state or their voters decided. Again, I just that would be the end of the game, right? 270 is the number. You get to the 270, and you're done. But again, take a look at that, how the Electoral College process works in your Moodle. There are questions about it on the test. Remember that Washington, D.C. is not a state, and to make it a state would take not just an act of the Senate, but it would actually take a change in the Constitution. It's the 10 by 10 designated area where the federal government exists outside of these states. But there are citizens, citizens of the country who live there. And so the Constitution was amended to allow their vote for president to count for something. And so 3 electoral votes go to Washington, D.C. So you take the 435 House members, the 100 senators for the 50 states, add those 2 together, that's 535. But you get 3 more electoral votes for Washington, D.C., that's 538. In order to win the Electoral College, you have to get a majority. A majority is a special number, if you will. It's half plus. So whatever takes you beyond half, so 50% plus, not 51%, though that's a majority. That's not the threshold. It's just whatever takes you above or beyond half. And as far as electoral votes go, we only assign full electoral votes. And so 269 plus 269 is 538. So 269 is half. Whatever takes us beyond half, 270. So that's where the 270 comes in. And so the march towards 270, often hear that as this process for the presidential election or choosing our president. And that 270, it really comes in chunks. Most states, 2 states do it a little differently. We won't get into that, but most states, including Michigan, have what's called winner take all, loser take none. And so all 16 electoral votes in Michigan, regardless of how close it was, and it was very close the last presidential election. I think it was 10,000 votes separated, President Trump from candidate Hillary Clinton. But all 100%, right, even though it was very, very close, 100% of the electoral votes ended up going towards President Trump. Same is true with California, which doesn't tend to be that close, and that's where you can get a popular vote going to one candidate, but the Electoral College going a different way. But California, New York, Texas, Florida, Michigan, it's all winner take all, loser take none. Nebraska and Maine do it a little differently. All right, guys, so where are we here? About 12:24. We'll call it good. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. I'll probably do this upstairs to get the kitschiness out of this, out of the camera, and this, whatever slow computer I must have down here in my office, and then if we have to, we can use the chalkboard or whiteboard behind us. Okay, don't hesitate to email me. I know this isn't optimal, but this is what we got heading out. Hopefully, we'll all be back in the classroom again pretty soon. Stupid COVID, right? All right.